The morning mist clung to the valley floor like gossamer threads when Ezra Thorne first heard the whimpering. He reined in his sorrel gelding beside the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the Hartwell place, listening to the sound that seemed to drift from somewhere among the cottonwoods. At first he thought it might be a coyote pup, but there was something too plaintive, too desperate about the cry for it to be wild. Ezra had been riding the boundaries of neighboring ranches for 3 weeks now, looking for work and finding precious little. The drought of 1887 had hit the territory hard, and most spreads were cutting hands rather than hiring them. But something about the persistent whimpering drew him from his horse, and he found himself pushing through the underbrush toward the sound. What he discovered made his heart clench with unexpected tenderness. Huddled against the base of an old cottonwood, barely visible among the fallen leaves, was the smallest puppy he'd ever seen. The little creature couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old, with fur that would have been golden if it weren't matted with mud and burrs. Its ribs showed clearly through its thin coat, and when it looked up at Ezra with enormous brown eyes, he saw a desperation that reminded him uncomfortably of his own recent circumstances. "Well, hello there, little one," Ezra said softly, crouching down and extending his hand. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The puppy tried to scramble away but was too weak to manage more than a few unsteady steps. Ezra could see that one of its front paws was injured, possibly caught in a trap or torn on barbed wire. Without hesitation, he scooped the tiny animal into his hands, feeling how light it was, how fragile. "Easy now," he murmured, tucking the puppy inside his coat, where it would be warm and secure. "Let's see about getting you some help." The nearest ranch was the Hartwell place, where he'd heard a widow was struggling to maintain a homestead since her husband's death the previous winter. Ezra had been planning to ask about work there anyway, though he'd been hesitant to approach a woman living alone. Now, with an injured puppy depending on him, such concerns seemed less important than finding immediate help for the little creature. As he rode toward the modest farmhouse nestled in a grove of oak trees, Ezra found himself wondering about the woman who lived there. He'd heard conflicting stories in town. Some folks said Catherine Hartwell was a saint who'd taken in every stray animal and hungry traveler in the county, while others whispered that she was too soft-hearted for her own good, that she'd lose the farm within a year if she didn't learn to be more practical. Catherine Hartwell was hanging laundry on the line when she saw the rider approaching, and her first instinct was the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with unexpected visitors. Living alone on the frontier meant that every stranger could represent either salvation or danger, and she'd learned to be cautious about both possibilities. But as the man drew closer, something about his careful, unhurried pace put her at ease. He rode like someone who understood that sudden movements could frighten people, and when he removed his hat as he approached, she could see kindness in his weathered face. "Morning, ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone raised in the South. "I'm Ezra Thorne, and I'm real sorry to bother you, but I've got a situation here that I thought you might could help with." Catherine stepped away from the clothesline, wiping her damp hands on her apron. The man was perhaps 30 years old, with sandy brown hair and blue eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of squinting into sun and wind. His clothes were clean but worn, and his horse was well cared for despite showing signs of hard travel. "What kind of situation, Mr. Thorne?" Instead of answering immediately, Ezra carefully opened his coat and withdrew the smallest, most pathetic puppy Catherine had ever seen. The little golden creature was barely conscious, its breathing shallow and rapid. "Found him by the creek. Looks like he's been on his own for days. He's hurt and hungry, and I was hoping." Ezra paused, suddenly uncertain. "Well, I heard tell you might know something about doctoring animals." Catherine's heart melted at the sight of the helpless puppy. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and gently took the little creature from Ezra's hands, feeling how cold and thin it was. "Oh, you poor little thing," she murmured, cradling it against her chest. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." She looked up at Ezra, seeing genuine concern in his expression. "Please, come in. We'll need to work together to help him." As they entered Catherine's small but spotlessly clean kitchen, Ezra found himself taking in details that spoke to the kind of woman she was. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, medical supplies were neatly organized on shelves, and the entire room had the warm, welcoming smell of fresh bread and healing plants. This was clearly a place where nurturing was both art and calling. "Set some water to boil," Catherine instructed, laying the puppy on a soft blanket near the stove. "We need to clean his wounds and get some warm milk into him if we can." Ezra moved to comply, surprised by how naturally they fell into working together. Catherine's hands were gentle but sure as she examined the puppy's injuries, and when she looked up at him with those warm brown eyes, he felt something shift in his chest. "The paw isn't broken, just badly cut," she said with relief. "And he's dehydrated more than anything else. With proper care, I think he'll recover." "You really think so?" Ezra asked, and Catherine was struck by the hope in his voice. Here was a man who cared deeply about the welfare of a creature he'd known for less than an hour. For 3 days and nights, Catherine and Ezra took turns caring for the little puppy they decided to call Lucky. The tiny animal required feeding every few hours with warm milk delivered through a cloth rag, and his wounds needed regular cleaning and fresh bandages. Neither Catherine nor Ezra was willing to leave the homestead while Lucky's life hung in the balance, so Ezra made camp in Catherine's barn with her permission, close enough to help during the night feedings. Catherine found herself looking forward to these quiet hours when they worked together, speaking in hushed tones so as not to disturb the sleeping puppy. Ezra had gentle hands for such a large man, and the way he spoke to Lucky soft words of encouragement and promise revealed a tenderness that made Catherine's heart flutter in ways she hadn't expected since her husband Thomas's death. "He's getting stronger," Ezra observed on the 3rd evening, watching as Lucky managed to lift his head and look around with brighter eyes. "Look at him trying to wag that little tail." Catherine smiled, reaching out to stroke the puppy's increasingly soft fur. "Animals have such will to live when they know they're loved. I think he understands that we're trying to help him." "You've been wonderful with him," Ezra said quietly. "I don't think he would have made it without your knowledge of healing, and I don't think he would have been found at all if you hadn't heard him crying," Catherine replied. "Sometimes I think the Lord puts people exactly where they need to be." Their eyes met across the box where Lucky was sleeping, and Catherine felt the familiar warmth that had been growing stronger each day. Ezra was unlike any man she'd known, gentle without being weak, strong without being domineering. The way he'd immediately wanted to help an injured animal spoke to a character that she found increasingly attractive. "Catherine," Ezra began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "I want you to know that I'll be moving on once Lucky is strong enough to travel. I don't want you to think I'm taking advantage of your kindness." Catherine felt her heart sink, though she tried not to let it show. "Of course, I understand that you have places to be," but Ezra shook his head. "That's just it, I don't, really. I've been drifting for months, looking for work, looking for a place to belong, but I don't want you to feel obligated to let me stay just because we've been caring for Lucky together." The honesty in his voice made Catherine look at him more directly. "What if it's not about obligation? What if I wanted you to stay?" The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Lucky stirred in his sleep, making soft puppy sounds that somehow made the moment even more tender. "I've been alone since Thomas died," Catherine continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told myself I was managing fine, and in many ways I was. But these past few days, working with you to save Lucky's life, I've remembered what it feels like to have a partner, someone who cares about the same things I care about." Ezra reached across the space between them and gently took her hand. "I've been thinking the same thing, but Catherine, you need to know that I don't have much to offer. No land, no money to speak of, just a willingness to work hard and a desire to build something lasting with the right person." A week later, Lucky had transformed from a dying puppy into an energetic ball of golden fluff who followed Catherine and Ezra everywhere they went. His injured paw had healed completely, and his appetite was so enthusiastic that Catherine had started calling him the little locust for the way he devoured everything in sight. But Lucky's recovery had brought with it an unexpected problem. As the puppy grew stronger and more confident, he began exhibiting protective behaviors that seemed far too advanced for such a young animal. When strangers approached the farmhouse, Lucky would position himself between them and Catherine, growling with surprising ferocity for something that still weighed less than 10 pounds. "I've never seen anything like it," Catherine told Ezra as they watched Lucky chase chickens in the yard, his tiny legs moving so fast they were almost a blur. "It's like he thinks he's a guard dog already." Ezra chuckled, but his expression was thoughtful. "Maybe he understands more than we think. Animals have instincts about people, about situations. Could be he senses that you need protecting." The truth of that statement became apparent 3 days later when the Brennan brothers rode into Catherine's yard with the swagger of men who were used to taking what they wanted. Jake and Caleb Brennan owned the largest spread in the county, and they'd been pressuring Catherine to sell her land ever since Thomas's death. "Mrs. Hartwell," Jake called out as he dismounted, his pale eyes taking in every detail of the property with calculating interest. Hope you've had time to reconsider our offer. Catherine stepped onto her porch, with Ezra emerging from the barn and Lucky taking up his protective position at her feet. The little puppy's hackles were raised, and he was growling with an intensity that made all three adults look down at him in surprise. I told you before, Mr. Brennan, the farm isn't for sale, Catherine said firmly. Thomas and I built this place together, and I intend to keep it. Caleb Brennan, the younger and more volatile of the brothers, spat into the dirt. That's foolish talk from a woman who can't possibly work this land alone. You'll lose it all within a year, and then you'll get nothing for it. She's not alone, Ezra said quietly, stepping closer to the porch. His hand rested casually near his gun belt, and something in his posture made both Brennan brothers reassess the situation. Jake's eyes narrowed as he studied Ezra. And who might you be, stranger? Name's Ezra Thorne. I'm Mrs. Hartwell's hired hand. Hired hand? Caleb laughed harshly. She can't afford hired help. Everyone knows she's barely scraping by. Lucky's growling intensified, and the puppy took a step forward, his tiny body trembling with protective fury. Catherine was amazed by the little animal's courage he was facing, men and horses that could crush him without effort, but his determination to defend her never wavered. Seems like even her dog knows you're not welcome here, Ezra observed, and Catherine noticed that his voice had taken on a harder edge. The confrontation might have escalated further, but at that moment Lucky did something extraordinary. The little puppy, still growling, began to bark with such volume and persistence that horses and humans alike stepped back in surprise. His tiny voice carried across the valley like an alarm, and within minutes, neighboring ranchers began appearing on the horizon, drawn by the unusual sound. Well, look at that, Ezra said with a grin. Seems like Lucky's got himself some backup. As riders converged on the Hartwell farm from 3 different directions, the Brennan brothers found themselves seriously outnumbered. What had started as an intimidation visit had turned into a very public confrontation, and Jake Brennan was smart enough to realize that pushing too hard with witnesses present would bring unwanted attention from the territorial authorities. This isn't over, Mrs. Hartwell, Jake said as he swung back into his saddle. You can't hold on to this place forever, and when you finally come to your senses, our offer won't be nearly so generous. But Lucky wasn't finished with his dramatic defense. As the Brennan brothers turned to leave, the little puppy charged after them, yapping at their horses' heels with such determined ferocity that both animals shied and danced sideways. It was a comical sight, a tiny golden fluff ball chasing away 2 of the most feared men in the county, but nobody was laughing. That's some dog you've got there, called out Frank Morrison, one of the neighboring ranchers who'd responded to Lucky's alarm. Never seen a pup that young show such protective instincts. Catherine scooped Lucky into her arms, feeling his little heart racing with excitement and adrenaline. He's been remarkable since the day we found him. It's like he appointed himself guardian of this place. As the neighbors gathered to make sure Catherine was all right, Ezra found himself studying the little puppy with new appreciation. Lucky's intervention had not only diffused a dangerous situation but had demonstrated something important about the bonds that were forming between all 3 of them. Mrs. Hartwell, said Sarah Chen, whose family ran the adjacent homestead, if the Brennans are pressuring you again, you should know that the rest of us are keeping an eye on things. Thomas was a good neighbor to all of us, and we won't see his widow bullied off her land. That's right, agreed Morrison, and it sounds like you've got good help now. He nodded toward Ezra with approval. Man who'll stand up to the Brennans is the kind of partner you want in this country. After the neighbors had departed and the excitement had died down, Catherine found herself sitting on her porch steps with Lucky in her lap and Ezra beside her, all 3 of them still processing the day's events. He knew, didn't he? Catherine said, stroking Lucky's soft fur. He knew those men meant trouble before any of us realized how serious it was. Ezra nodded thoughtfully. Animals can sense things we miss. But Catherine, what that puppy did today, calling for help, standing his ground against men and horses 100 times his size, that takes more than instinct. That takes love. Catherine looked down at Lucky, who had fallen asleep in her arms with the complete trust of a creature who knew he was safe and loved. Thomas always said that the best judge of a person's character was how they treated animals and children. He would have loved Lucky. What about me? Ezra asked quietly. What would Thomas have thought about me? Catherine considered the question seriously, remembering her husband's practical wisdom and kind heart. I think he would have appreciated the way you saved Lucky, without expecting anything in return. The way you've worked hard without being asked. The way you've respected my independence while still offering protection. She paused, then added with a soft smile. And I think he would have noticed the way Lucky has adopted you as part of his family. As if to prove her point, Lucky stirred in his sleep and reached out one tiny paw to rest against Ezra's hand. As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Lucky grew from a helpless puppy into a confident young dog, whose devotion to Catherine and Ezra had become legendary among the local ranchers. He had developed an uncanny ability to sense trouble long before humans could detect it, and his protective instincts had saved the farm from everything from wandering bears to would-be thieves. But Lucky's most remarkable quality was the way he seemed to understand the growing bond between Catherine and Ezra, actively working to bring them together with the determination of a furry matchmaker. When Catherine worked in her garden, Lucky would fetch Ezra from whatever task occupied him. When Ezra sat alone on the porch in the evenings, Lucky would insist that Catherine join them, refusing to settle down until all three were together. That dog's got more sense than most people, Ezra observed one evening as Lucky positioned himself precisely between them on the porch swing, forcing Catherine and Ezra to sit close together. He knows what's good for us even when we're too stubborn to admit it ourselves. Catherine laughed, but she couldn't deny the truth of Ezra's words. Over the months since Lucky's rescue, she and Ezra had fallen into a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. He'd proved himself invaluable around the farm, fixing what was broken, improving what could be better, and always consulting with her before making decisions. Unlike some men who might have tried to take over, Ezra respected her ownership and leadership while contributing his own skills and knowledge. The harvest was good this year, Catherine said, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Better than Thomas and I ever managed. The new irrigation system you designed made all the difference. We designed, Ezra corrected gently. You knew where the water needed to go. I just figured out how to get it there. We make a good team. Lucky looked up at both of them and wagged his tail as if he understood and approved of the sentiment. The dog had grown into a beautiful animal, his golden coat now thick and lustrous, his brown eyes bright with intelligence and affection. Ezra, Catherine began, then hesitated. Over the months she'd grown to love this quiet, gentle man who'd brought so much stability and joy into her life. But the conventions of frontier society made it difficult for a widow to express such feelings directly, even when her heart was full to overflowing. What is it, Catherine? I've been thinking about winter, about the storms that are coming, and how isolated we get when the snow blocks the passes. She took a deep breath. It doesn't seem practical for you to keep sleeping in the barn when there's a perfectly good spare room in the house. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, understanding the magnitude of what she was suggesting. For a respectable widow to invite a man to live in her house, even with separate bedrooms, was a significant step that would set tongues wagging throughout the county. Are you sure about that, Catherine? People will talk. Let them talk, Catherine said with surprising firmness. I'm tired of living my life according to what other people might think. Lucky chose both of us that first day, and I think maybe it's time I admitted that I have too. Lucky seemed to sense the importance of the moment. He sat up and placed one paw on Catherine's knee and the other on Ezra's, looking back and forth between them with an expression that could only be described as hopeful. Well, Ezra said with a slow smile, if Lucky approves, how can I argue? The first snow of winter arrived early, blanketing the valley in pristine white and transforming Catherine's farm into a scene from a fairy tale. Lucky had never seen snow before, and his joyous discovery of this new element provided endless entertainment for Catherine and Ezra as they watched him leap and bound through the drifts, barking at snowflakes and trying to catch them in his mouth. With Ezra now living in the house, the long winter evenings took on a warmth and intimacy that Catherine had forgotten was possible. They would sit by the fire after dinner, Lucky stretched out between them, planning improvements for the spring while snow whispered against the windows. Sometimes Ezra would read aloud from the newspapers that arrived sporadically from Denver, and sometimes Catherine would work on her needlepoint while Ezra whittled toys for Lucky or repaired tack and tools. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Catherine finally found the courage to speak about the feelings that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Ezra, she said, setting down her needlework, there's something I need to tell you. Lucky lifted his head at the serious tone in her voice, and Ezra looked up from the leather he'd been stitching. What's on your mind, Catherine? When I invited you to stay in the house, I told myself it was just practical, a sensible arrangement for the winter months. She paused, gathering her courage, but that wasn't the whole truth. Ezra set aside his work and gave her his full attention. What was the whole truth? The truth is that I've fallen in love with you. Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know it soon. I know people will say it's improper or disrespectful to Thomas's memory, but I can't hide it anymore. These months with you have been the happiest I've known since Thomas died. And Lucky isn't the only one who's chosen you as family. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Lucky's contented sighs. Catherine felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for Ezra's response, terrified that she'd misread the signs and ruined the comfortable life they'd built together. But when Ezra finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Catherine, I've loved you since that first day when you took Lucky into your arms without a moment's hesitation. Watching you care for him, seeing your kindness and strength, the way you've treated me like family when I was just a drifter with nothing to offer, I never thought I'd be lucky enough to find someone like you. He moved from his chair to sit beside her on the small sofa, taking her hands in his. But I wanted to be sure you were ready, that you weren't just grateful for the help around the farm. A woman like you deserves a love that's real and lasting, not just convenience. Lucky, sensing the emotional intensity of the moment, padded over and placed his head on Catherine's knee, looking up at both of them with those wise brown eyes. I think our friend here has been trying to tell us something for months, Catherine said, reaching down to stroke Lucky's soft ears. He knew we belonged together before we did. Ezra laughed softly. Smart dog. Smarter than us, apparently. When Ezra leaned in to kiss her, Catherine felt as if her heart might burst with happiness. It was a gentle kiss, full of promise and tenderness, and when they broke apart, both were smiling through tears of joy. So what happens now? Catherine asked. Now we make it official, Ezra replied. If you'll have me, Catherine Hartwell, I'd like to marry you. I want to be your husband, your partner in all things, and Lucky's official father. At the sound of his name, Lucky's tail began wagging so enthusiastically that his entire body wiggled with joy. The spring wedding of Catherine Hartwell and Ezra Thorne became the social event of the season in their small frontier community. Catherine wore her mother's ivory silk dress, carefully preserved and still beautiful, while Ezra stood proud in a new black suit ordered specially from Denver. But the true star of the ceremony was Lucky, who wore a ribbon around his neck and seemed to understand the importance of the occasion, sitting perfectly still throughout the vows. Reverend Matthews, who had married Catherine and Thomas 15 years earlier, spoke movingly about second chances and the way love could bloom again even after loss. The heart, he said, is not a vessel that empties when tragedy strikes, but a garden that can always grow new flowers when tended with care and patience. The entire community turned out for the celebration that followed, with neighbors bringing food and music to transform Catherine's farm into a place of pure joy. As the afternoon wore on and the dancing began, Lucky appointed himself official greeter, charming every guest with his friendly demeanor and obvious happiness at being the center of attention. Look at him, Catherine said to Ezra as they watched Lucky accept treats and pets from a group of admiring children. He's holding court like a little prince. Well, he is the reason we're all here, Ezra replied, pulling his new wife closer as they swayed to the music of Frank Morrison's fiddle. If I hadn't found him that morning by the creek, I might never have met you. Catherine smiled up at her husband, still marveling at how right it felt to think of him that way. Do you really think it was just chance? Or do you think maybe Lucky was meant to bring us together? Before Ezra could answer, Lucky himself provided a response by trotting over and sitting directly at their feet, looking up at them with an expression of such satisfied contentment that several nearby guests burst into laughter. I think, Ezra said, bending down to scratch Lucky behind the ears. Our friend here has made his opinion quite clear. As the celebration continued into the evening, Catherine found herself reflecting on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them all together. A year ago, she'd been a lonely widow struggling to maintain her farm and her independence. Now she was part of a family again, not just with Ezra, but with Lucky, who had somehow woven himself so completely into their lives that she couldn't imagine existence without him. The three of them had created something special, she realized, something that transcended the typical relationships between humans and animals. Lucky wasn't just a pet. He was a partner, a protector, a bridge between hearts that might never have found each other without his intervention. Mrs. Thorne, Ezra said softly, trying out her new name as the last of the guests prepared to depart. I like the sound of that, Catherine replied, leaning into his embrace while Lucky settled down beside them, his head resting on both their feet in a gesture of absolute contentment. What do you say we take our family home? Ezra suggested. Catherine looked around at the farm that had been Thomas's dream, and was now becoming something new. A place where different kinds of love could coexist, where past and future could blend into something beautiful and lasting. "Yes," she said simply. "Let's go home." 5 years later, the Thorne farm had become one of the most prosperous homesteads in the territory, but more importantly, it had become known throughout the region as a place where love and kindness flourished. Catherine and Ezra had expanded the original house, adding rooms for the children they hoped to have, and creating a welcoming space for the steady stream of travelers who sought them out for help with injured animals. Lucky, now a magnificent golden dog with silver touches around his muzzle, had sired 3 litters of puppies that carried on his remarkable instincts for protection and healing. The Lucky puppies, as they came to be known, were prized throughout the territory for their intelligence, loyalty, and uncanny ability to sense trouble before it arrived. But Lucky himself remained devoted to Catherine and Ezra above all others, and his greatest joy came from the arrival of little Thomas Thorne, born in the spring of their 3rd year of marriage. The baby had been premature and fragile, requiring constant care and attention, and Lucky had appointed himself the child's guardian with the same fierce dedication he'd once shown to Catherine. "He won't leave Tommy's side," Catherine told Dr. Morrison during one of the physician's regular visits to check on the baby's progress. "Even when we move the cradle from room to room, Lucky follows and positions himself where he can watch over him." Dr. Morrison, who had initially been skeptical of having a dog so close to an infant, had to admit that Lucky's presence seemed to have a calming effect on the child. "I've never seen anything like it," he confessed to Ezra. "That dog seems to know when the baby's having trouble breathing before any of us notice. 3 times now he's alerted you to problems that could have been serious." Indeed, Lucky had developed an almost supernatural ability to monitor baby Thomas's health. When the child's breathing became labored during sleep, Lucky would gently wake Catherine with a soft whine. When Thomas ran fever, Lucky would lie beside the cradle to provide warmth and comfort. And when the baby finally began to thrive, gaining weight and strength with each passing week, Lucky's obvious joy and relief touched everyone who witnessed it. "It's like he understands how precious Thomas is to us," Catherine said one evening as they watched Lucky carefully clean the baby's tiny fingers with gentle licks. "He's determined that nothing will happen to him." Ezra nodded, remembering his own childhood on a farm where animals and humans lived in close partnership. "My grandmother used to say that some animals are born with healing spirits, that they come into our lives when we need them most. I think Lucky might be one of those special creatures." The truth of that observation became clear during the terrible influenza outbreak that struck the territory in their 4th year of marriage. Catherine and Ezra both fell ill, leaving them unable to care properly for young Thomas, who had mercifully avoided the disease. It was Lucky who stepped into the breach, somehow understanding that the baby needed extra protection during his parents' illness. For 2 weeks, Lucky never left Thomas's side, alerting Sarah Chen and other neighbors when the baby needed feeding or changing, positioning himself between the child and any potential source of infection. When Catherine and Ezra finally recovered enough to resume care of their son, they found Lucky exhausted but triumphant, having successfully protected the most precious member of their family through the crisis. "He saved Tommy's life," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion as she gathered both her son and Lucky into her arms. "There's no doubt in my mind about that." On a golden autumn morning 8 years after Lucky first entered their lives, Catherine and Ezra sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Thomas, now a sturdy 5-year-old, was teaching his little sister Mary how to throw a stick for Lucky, who at 11 years old was beginning to show his age but still possessed the patient gentleness that had always been his trademark. "Mama, watch," Thomas called out, throwing the stick with all his might. Lucky dutifully retrieved it, though his gait was slower now, and brought it back to drop at Mary's feet. The little girl, barely 3 years old, clapped her hands in delight and threw her arms around Lucky's neck in a hug that the old dog accepted with dignified pleasure. "He's slowing down," Catherine observed, noting how Lucky had to rest more frequently during their daily walks around the farm. Ezra reached over and took her hand, understanding the sadness in her voice. Lucky had been the foundation of their family, the catalyst for their love story, and the thought of losing him was almost unbearable. "He's had a good life, Catherine. A life full of love and purpose." "The best life," Catherine agreed, watching as Lucky settled down in his favorite spot on the porch, positioning himself where he could keep watch over both children while they played. "But I'm not ready to say goodbye." That evening, as the family gathered for their usual quiet time before bed, Lucky did something he hadn't done in years. He brought Catherine an old, tattered cloth, The same rag they'd used to feed him milk during those first desperate days when his life hung in the balance. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she realized he was trying to tell them something, to communicate in the only way he could. "Oh, Lucky," she whispered, kneeling down to embrace the old dog. "You remember, don't you? You remember how we saved each other?" Ezra joined them on the floor, and soon Thomas and Mary had crawled over as well, creating a family circle with Lucky at the center. The old dog's tail wagged weakly, but his eyes were bright with contentment as he looked around at the faces of those he loved most. "Tell us the story, Mama," Thomas requested, as he did every night. "Tell us about how Daddy found Lucky." So Catherine told the familiar tale once more, about the crying puppy by the creek, about the gentle man who couldn't walk away from someone in need, about how caring for one small creature had brought two lonely hearts together. As she spoke, Lucky closed his eyes and seemed to smile, as if he too was remembering those precious early days. 3 weeks later, Lucky passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his family. They buried him beneath the oak tree where Catherine's clothesline had hung that first day when Ezra rode into their lives, and carved a simple inscription on a wooden marker. "Lucky, who taught us that the smallest acts of kindness can change everything." Years passed, and the Thorne farm continued to prosper. Thomas and Mary grew into strong, compassionate adults who carried on their parents' tradition of helping anyone human or animal who needed aid. The Lucky bloodline continued through his descendants, spreading throughout the territory and beyond, each new generation carrying forward the special gift of knowing when love was needed most. But on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the oak trees and sunset painted the valley in shades of gold, Catherine and Ezra would sometimes see a flash of golden fur among the shadows, hear the ghost of a gentle bark on the breeze, and know that Lucky's spirit still watched over the family he had helped create. Their love story had begun with a helpless puppy's cry for help, but it had grown into something eternal, a testament to the truth that sometimes the smallest creatures bring the greatest gifts, and that love, once planted, blooms forever.